And welcome to the Ethnography Basics lecture in the Research Methods in Environmental Social Sciences course. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about what ethnography is, who does ethnography, and how. So let's get started. So first let's start off with what is ethnography. You've most likely heard of this method in the context of anthropology. But despite the method's strong roots in the discipline of anthropology, ethnography is a qualitative method that is not discipline specific. So, quite literally, the roots of the term ethnography come from the Latin roots ethno, meaning a social unit or grouping of humans, and graphia or graphy, which means description or representation of an object. So traditionally, when ethnography was first employed in the anthropological discipline, the main goal was to describe how a people from a certain social group, like a geographic area or an ethnic group, lived their daily lives. And Merriam-Webster gives us a good definition. Ethnography is the study and systematic recording of human cultures, also a descriptive work produced from such research. So that descriptive work that we're talking about right here is called an ethnographic text. And we'll talk a little bit more about what an ethnographic text is later. So, like I said, ethnography aims to describe life as it is lived and experienced by a people somewhere, sometime. Some argue that ethnography is beyond just documenting the life of a people because it aims to describe life as it is lived and experienced by a people. So a famous anthropologist named Richard Geertz suggests that we can't know the reality of how or why people live the way they live, but that through careful observation and speaking to people, we can understand how people experience culture. And Geertz called this careful observation and subsequent description of people's experience thick description. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So, ironically, ethnography was actually defined in contrast to the anthropological discipline. The need for long-term ethnographic fieldwork came out of critiques about armchair anthropology, where an anthropologist would make claims about peoples and cultures from the materials they read rather than from actual experience with those people. So here are two examples of anthropologists who began the movement towards long-term ethnographic fieldwork as anthropological best practice. So on the left here we have Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead studied adolescent experience, sexuality, and gender norms in Samoa in the early 1900s. She sought to understand how societal norms about sexual activity and gender differed from European and American norms, and how those differences in norms might alter the experience of adolescence for Samoan youth. Hers was a landmark study in long-term in situ fieldwork that challenged the ways many people viewed the balance of nature versus nurture in determining adolescent experience and the universality of the human experience in adolescence, which she basically said that it is not universal and depends on culture. So then over here we have Bronislaw Malinowski, and he's credited with defining ethnographic practice through the use of long-term intensive fieldwork in another cultural context. Here, you can see him in his quintessential anthropologist outfit, which he is featured in almost every photo in. And he is spending time with the Trobriand Islanders, about whom he wrote a book or an ethnographic text, like I termed earlier. Malinowski was known for his theory of functionalism, where he analyzed how Trobriand Islanders' social structures function to meet the needs of individuals and thus societal needs. And this was an important moment for understanding how ethnography could answer questions about how and why societies function the way that they do. So, like I said, ethnography has roots in anthropology, but is not a discipline-specific method. So, while ethnography is usually associated with anthropologists, other people do ethnography too, like sociologists, human geographers, political scientists, public policy scholars, linguistic scholars, and economists, and more. What you need to know is that ethnography is a qualitative method that can be used to answer specific kinds of questions. And in order to understand what kinds of questions it can answer, we need to know what kinds of tools ethnography can provide us with. So as we move forward, I'm going to talk a little bit about these tools and how we do ethnography so that we can understand what kind of research questions ethnography fits with. So what does ethnography look like in real life? I do my ethnographic fieldwork in Rapa Nui, which is also known as Easter Island, Chile. And there I study how the trend of large marine protected areas interacts with indigenous social movements on the island. This research topic lends itself well to embedding myself within the island in order to understand how the idea of large marine protected areas is not only received, but processed and put into practice in local context. It's also important to study social movements in context in order to better understand their ideas and strategies from their own perspectives and experiences. And as you can see here, I have a little bit of fun doing ethnography too. So how do we do ethnography? Let's look in our ethnography toolkit to find out. The most prominent way of doing ethnography is through long-term fieldwork, where the researcher lives in the field or the location where the object of study resides and uses methods like participant observation, interviews, document collection, and a mixed bag of other potential methods depending on what kind of research question you're asking. So, fieldwork is the gathering of qualitative data through researchers' immersion in the field site, or the locale of the object of study. For example, I do fieldwork concerning the Rapa Nui people in the field, which is located on Easter Island, or Rapa Nui. Fieldwork doesn't have to be long-term, but when employing ethnography, fieldwork is typically around 1 year. Fieldwork most often uses data collection like participant observation, but there are also many other methods that can be employed during fieldwork, including interviews, document collection, etc., depending on what kind of research questions we ask. So a staple of ethnographic fieldwork is this participant observation, which can be defined as the process enabling researchers to learn about the activities of a people under study in the natural setting through observing and participating in those activities. Participant observation usually requires the practice of writing field notes. And the ethnographer typically records their observations and interactions throughout their time in the field and anything else that they observe and find interesting. Typically, ethnographers try to employ thick description in the analysis of their field notes, and I'll define that more in a minute. So, how is ethnography exactly different from other qualitative methods? Firstly, it is historically grounded in anthropological debates. So, like I said, it is not discipline specific. Ethnography does not equal anthropology. But because ethnography and anthropology developed in tandem, anthropological debates such as structure versus agency, generalization versus specificity are important to understanding what ethnography can help us do. And these debates are essential to understanding the development of ethnography over time, which happened alongside the anthropological discipline. I don't have time to go over all of those anthropological debates, but we'll talk a little bit more specifically about what those are later in this lecture. So secondly, there's a reliance on participant observation as the main method. Participant observation, being in the field, is a non-negotiable for ethnography. In order to understand how life is lived, one must be there, living. Thirdly, ethnography is a sensibility. It's an approach to where meaning is found. So, where do we find culture? How do we explain culture? And ethnography really takes that those answers are found on the ground in context by living life every day with the people who are experiencing these things. And fourth, ethnographic methodology typically aims to produce what we talked about earlier, an ethnographic text. And a good example of an ethnographic text here would be Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific, which that picture that we saw earlier of the man off the veranda in the white clothes, he was the one, Malinowski, who wrote this ethnographic text. So you may remember this graphic from one of our first lectures exploring all the different kinds of possible research. So let's look at where ethnography falls on our research axes. So what kind of research model does ethnography value? We see a scale here from specific and intensive research that is qualitative in nature to the other side of our scale, which is extensive quantitative research that works towards generalization. And we talked a little bit about this specificity versus generalization as being an important anthropological debate as well. There have been significant debates over whether ethnography provides data that is generalizable to other situations, and that debate is not settled. However, in general, ethnography provides a detailed, thick description of a specific case study that may or may not be generalizable to other situations through the application of data analysis to theory through a grounded theory approach. We'll continue to discuss how grounded theory approaches work as we move along in this course. So, thick description is a way of observing and describing data that places it within its cultural context to provide the researcher with enough context to interpret those descriptions. And that's a really important component of how we do ethnography. Through having thick description, we're able to understand how things happen in context, answering our research questions in context. And that's a really important part of this method. So, on a scale from positivist, objective observer to a subjective, postmodern observer, where does ethnography fall? So, ethnography privileges thick description so that a researcher can interpret cultural context. This interpretation, however, is typically balanced by an ethnographer's acknowledgement of their positionality through a process of reflexivity, meaning a continued reflection on the part of the ethnographer of how their own role and their own history affects how they interpret data, even with thick description providing a grounded cultural context. So our methods axis here is called data/methods, and we're calling it that because these tools are inseparable from the types of data that they produce. Methods produce particular kinds of data, and it's important not to separate those. So on a scale from qualitative to quantitative, ethnography is a fundamentally qualitative method based on participant observation, interviewing, and often document collection. However, depending on the research question one asks, there may be opportunities for an ethnographer to collect both qualitative and quantitative data, such as through a survey. So, data analysis is most often conducted through a qualitative coding approach, where themes are coded for throughout the data, like field notes, interview transcripts, and collected documents. and coding for themes will depend on what kind of research question one is asking. There are other kinds of data analysis that can happen through the collection of ethnographic data, such as things like network analysis to understand the inner workings of a particular social system, or a content analysis to understand how, when, and why specific content or themes are invoked. And lastly, how does ethnography engage with the application of its work? Traditionally, in anthropology, ethnography has resulted in an ethnographic text. However, ethnography is used widely outside of anthropology now, and the products coming out of ethnographic work have significantly diversified. While early ethnography served the purpose of describing a culture or a people, later works used grounded theory approaches to critically analyze how ethnographic results could inform different theory. Now there are a variety of methodological approaches to research that privilege how ethnography can inform the work of governments, organizations, and communities, and we'll have plenty of examples of these kinds of work later in this course.